Now, let's make the intro section. This is the part before the singing comes in when the synthesizer plays a riff. It sounds like this. We saw how note blocks on top of some materials can produce drum sounds. Certain other materials can allow note blocks to play pitches with different instrument sounds. The sound from emerald blocks is our best option for recreating the synthesizer heard in the song. Let's start making the synth riff. Just like with the drum loop, we'll want to start by making a chain of alternating note blocks and repeaters. We'll build this chain on top of emerald blocks, since note blocks pair with emerald to make a synthesizer sound, and repeaters work on top of pretty much anything. We're starting with the first phrase of the melody. This is the first 8 beats. Not every note of the melody happens exactly on one of the beats. Sometimes notes happen in between beats. So, including these in-between notes, or upbeats, our phrase will be a chain of the length of 16 note blocks. For the 16 note block repeater pairs, I'm laying a line of 32 emeralds. Then I'll top this with alternating note blocks and repeaters, making sure the repeaters are set to a tick length of 2 by clicking each one once. We're using 2 ticks so that the notes play at a speed close to the tempo of the original song. Now let's hear how this sounds by connecting a trail of redstone dust and a button to the beginning. It doesn't sound quite like the song yet, but we can hear a constant pulse that's almost like a metronome. Now we can create rhythm by deleting the note blocks we don't need. So how do we know which note blocks we do need? Remember, this line represents the first 8 beats of the synth riff. If we listen back to the phrase, you might hear that the first 2 notes of the melody happen on the first and third beats. So to start, we keep the very first note block on beat 1, but then we can delete the next one, the upbeat between 1 and 2, as well as the next 2 note blocks, beat 2 and its upbeat. But when we get to the next note block, which represents the third beat, we'll save it. After beat 3, the next note we need is on the upbeat after beat 4, so we'll delete the upbeat after 3 and beat 4, and then save the next one after. To save some time, here is what the rhythm for the phrase looks like. The beats of the song are labeled with their number, and the pluses represent upbeats. All note blocks we deleted were replaced with redstone dust, so that the signal still gets passed along. Let's give it a listen. That's the rhythm for the first phrase. Since the intro, and actually every section of the song, consists of 4 phrases, it makes sense to represent a whole section as a large square. We have our first side of the square. Let's make the other 3. We'll start the first block of the second phrase at the end of the first phrase. The new phrase will continue perpendicular to the first. In the synth riff, the second phrase is actually identical to the first, so we'll duplicate what we've already done in this new position. The third phrase is different from the first 2. Again, we'll start at the end of the previous phrase and add the new phrase as the next side of the square. Here is the pattern for the third phrase. The fourth phrase of the synth riff has no notes, but we'll still need that side of the square to account for the time that we want the synthesizer to rest. It'll simply contain emeralds topped with alternating repeaters and redstone dust. Now we should have a 33 by 33 square with the rhythmic patterns for the 4 phrases. Before we listen, we'll make sure to leave out the final repeater so that the section does not loop infinitely. Let's take a listen. Cool, it's starting to sound like blinding lights. Now we just need to change the notes. You can tune a note block by clicking it a certain number of times until you get the note you want. An unclicked note block is the note F sharp, click it once to go up to G, and so on. Here are the notes for the synth riff. Notice how the first 2 phrases are identical again. In order to get these notes, here's how many times each note block must be clicked. So now, let's go through and click each note block the proper number of times. Okay, great. Now we should have completed the synth melody. Let's take a listen. Now we can tell what song it is. Now, let's add the bass line. We'll build the bass part in a slightly larger square around the synth square. While emerald blocks pair with note blocks to make a good synth sound, for bass, we'll use wood. Start by making a large wood square around the synth square, leaving an aisle of 1 block between the 2 squares. We can leave out the last few blocks so that there's still space to trigger the start of the music. Next, we'll top the bass square with repeaters on every other block, making sure they line up with repeaters on the synth square. Each repeater should be set to 2 ticks. When you get to the corners, make sure you don't add too many repeaters. We only need 1 for each repeater in the inner square. We'll be able to use redstone dust to fill out the extra space. With the synth part, we've seen how rhythm can be created by including only certain note blocks. We can use the same technique to build the rhythm of the bass line. It may be hard to clearly make out what the bass is doing in the intro just by listening, so we'll show you the rhythmic pattern. Here are the note blocks we'll need. Okay, so I've added note blocks in these positions, and everywhere else I've filled in with redstone dust. Let's take a listen to the rhythm of the bass line. You may or may not recognize the rhythm of the bass on its own. So let's tune the notes. Here are the notes of the bass line. And here are the number of times to click each bass note block. I'll enter these in, and then we can take a listen. So I've tuned the bass notes by clicking each one the appropriate number of times. Just a side note, if you accidentally click a note block too many times, you'll want to delete the note block, make a new one, and start tuning again. There's no way to lower the pitch by 1. Okay, let's listen to the bass line. Let's listen to how it sounds along with the synthesizer part we made. Nice. Now let's hear how it sounds with a recording of the song in the background. The intro section is really coming along. It'll sound even better once we sync it up with the drum loop.